this presentation, I will talk about Don Dillman's guidelines for constructing closed-ended questions. When crafting closed-ended questions with attitude scales, it's crucial to present both sides of the scale. For example, a question like, to what extent do you agree with requiring PhD students to learn statistics? Is vague because it only asks about agreement. A better question would be, to what extent do you agree or disagree with requiring PhD students to learn statistics? By framing the question to allow both agreement and disagreement, you give the opportunity to for the respondent to voice both sides, and you don't bias it towards agreement. When designing multiple choice questions, it is important to ensure that the list of answer categories includes all reasonable options. For example, a question asking, from which of these sources did you first learn about the budget cuts? My list, radio, television, newspaper. However, this list excluded other possibilities such as colleagues, supervisors, online platforms. To improve the questions, include a more comprehensive set of options that reflects our reasonable sources. You could also make it partially closed-ended question with other please specify, but remember to only do that if you believe the majority of the respondents will choose the options you put there, and only a small number will select other. It's important to create categories that are mutually exclusive. For example, if you ask, from which of these sources did you learn about the budget cuts? And include both email and president's newsletters options, there is a risk that respondents might find these two categories overlap because they received the email from the email newsletter from the president. This overlap can confuse respondents and skew results. A better approach would be to separate categories more clearly and offer either into two questions if there is a difference between source and from whom the news came, or you could use another category. You can use focus groups and interviews to make sure that you have a reasonable set of the choice of answer spaces for closed-ended questions significantly affects how respondents interact with the survey and the quality of data collection. For single answer questions, radio buttons are the most appropriate as they visually indicate that only one answer can be selected. For multiple answer questions, check boxes are the best choice because they allow respondents to select more than one option. Drop-down menus can also be used, but they are best avoided unless the number of options is too large for radio buttons. Drop-downs can make it easy for respondents to accidentally change their response, and they tend to increase the time needed to answer. Additionally, visual analog scales or slider bars may be used for questions involving degrees of satisfaction or agreement, but while they provide detailed responses, they often take longer to complete, so they should be carefully considered in terms of time and efficiency. When designing closed-ended questions, it is important to use visual cues to make it clear whether the question is intended to have a single response or multiple responses. For example, when asking respondents to choose between these options, such as preferred type of music, you might say, please indicate what type of music you listen to most frequently. Mark only one. Here, radio buttons should be used to indicate that only one answer can be selected. On the other hand, when asking respondents to select all types of music they listen to, you would use checkboxes and phrase the question. Please indicate which type of music you listen to frequently. Check all that apply. By visually differentiating the types of response spaces, you reduce the confusion and ensure that the responses are provided Ranking questions are valuable for understanding priority or preference, but they can be overwhelming if respondents are asked to rank too many items at once. Asking respondents to rank a long list of items forces them to evaluate each option multiple times, which increases cognitive burden and may lead to incomplete or inaccurate responses. For instance, asking participants to rank a long list of professional development support options will lead to fatigue. Instead, it's better to ask respondents to rank only a few of the most important items at once, which reduces cognitive load. For example, you could ask them the two most important options. In survey design, it's important to avoid bias by creating unequal comparisons, especially when formulating response categories. For example, consider the question, which group plays a major role in student success on standardized tests? With response options, school, family, community, and well-trained teachers. The term well-trained introduces an unequal comparison by emphasizing one option over the others, potentially biasing the responses towards selecting well-trained teachers. A better approach would be to remove any adjectives or modifiers that imply strong importance. Instead, a more neutral phrasing order effects can significantly influence survey responses, as respondents unconsciously factor earlier or later options depending on how they are presented. To minimize this bias, it's important to randomize the order of response options, particularly when there is concern that the order in which options are presented will impact how people respond. For example, if two questions are closely related, such as to what extent does the FCAT influence your teaching and how familiar are you with the requirements of the FCAT, presenting them in a fixed order may introduce bias. The first question could influence how respondents perceive the second. Particularly, social desirability bias can play a role here. You can randomize the responses to make sure that it's balanced, and you can also consider an order that would provide adequate response, such as from general to specific. The use of markup that apply might lead the respondents to select the first few options because they are presented first, or at least they will consider the first options more than the last in a long list. Forced choice questions, on the other hand, limit respondents to one answer, reducing the chance of bias. Asking about a single preferred genre, such as what type of music do you prefer to listen to work, force respondents to choose their most preferred answer, making it easier to analyze and compare responses. When multiple choices are needed, forced choice questions are preferred because they don't suffer the same problem. When selecting the type of scale for a question, researchers must decide whether to use a unipolar or bipolar scale. A bipolar scale presents two opposite ends, such as strongly agree to strongly disagree, or very superior to very inferior. Bipolar scales are useful when you want to capture both positive and negative extremes, such as attitude or satisfaction surveys. On the other hand, a unipolar scale has only one direction, with a neutral point in the middle, like very successful to not all successful. Unipolar scales are often used when surveys are focusing on the presence or absence of a specific characteristic, where the focus is measuring the intensity, rather than comparing two extremes. Choosing the right type depends on what you want to measure, where you want to focus on. The length of scale is critical for reliability and validity. Research has shown that for bipolar scales, a range of 5 to 7 typically yields the best results. provide a good balance between granularity and simplicity. For polar scales, a scale of 4 or 5 points is generally most effective. Longer scales may be too complicated for responses to navigate, and providing the positive side of bipolar scales first allow faster responses, and research has shown there is no difference in bipolar scale with respect to whether you provide a midpoint. When creating a scale with a neutral or undecided option, it's important to place the non-substantive category, which in this case would be undecided, at the end of the scale to avoid individuals mistaking it by the neutral option, which is the same. Neutral would be the same as neither agree nor disagree. The undecided option should be avoided because it will lead to missing data. I mean, in the quantitative analysis, usually an undecided option is coded as missing data. So it's not very useful from the point. It's important to choose construct specific labels. So in this example, the question, to what extent do you agree or disagree that statistics classes are useful for graduate education, is inappropriate because the question is asking about usefulness, but you are using a agree to disagree scale. A revision of that would be how useful are statistics classes for your graduate education. It's important to avoid vague quantifiers when possible. Vague quantifiers, like very frequently or occasionally, are problematic because they're interpreted different by each respondent. For example, asking how frequently do you go to the gym, with the response options very frequently, frequently, sometimes, and never, can be confusing, and some people may think very frequently is twice a week. Some people may think very frequently is every day. It's better to provide a more precise scale, such as this one, which is in terms of days per week or times. When designing scales, you should make sure the categories are balanced in terms of conceptual distance. So in this case, note that there is 3 options related to satisfaction and 1 option related to dissatisfaction. So this is not a balanced scale. In this case, you should add 2 more options. So you should add the somewhat dissatisfied, mostly dissatisfied, and completely dissatisfied. You should also maintain spacing between the categories that's consistent with the measurement intent. For survey software, they handle this automatically, but if you were doing the survey on paper, you have to be careful. So in this case, note that there is more spacing between agree and neutral and disagree than between strongly agree and strongly disagree. And here may be an artifact that strongly agree or strongly disagree is longer. A solution here would be to put the options in the vertical format instead of horizontal to avoid this spacing. Providing clear verbal labels for each category improves reliability. You should always label every point, because if you don't, it's cognitively unclear to the respondents. So in this example where you just label the endpoints, you are introducing unreliability. Polar labels, are cognitively more difficult, and you get more positive ratings with fully labeled scales, and that allows more reliability. Also, avoid putting numbers in the scales. Numeric labels give impression that it's a continuum, which is not. So you should remove numbers and use just labels, and don't use numbers, either all numbers or numbers at the ends of the scale. They are both inappropriate. When using bipolar scales, branching them can significantly ease the cognitive burden for respondents, improving response quality and simplifying the decision-making process. So, for example, instead of using one question, a long bipolar scale from very satisfied to very dissatisfied, you can branch the question in two parts. First, ask the respondents if they are satisfied or dissatisfied, and then ask them to rate the level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. In analysis, you would combine this into a single question, because if you don't, you end up with missing data. You should also consider providing scales that are appropriate for the distribution of responses in the population. So in this case here, these commuting responses are framed in terms of hours, which are unrealistic in most situations. A way to define what would be appropriate distribution would be through focus groups or interviews or using previous data sets.